Hi guys, welcome to week 11. Today we're going to be discussing language contact and lexical borrowing. Lexical borrowing is a concept we brought up last week when we were together and we talked about word formation processes. And these various word formation processes listed here on the screen in front of you are what we covered last week. And we discussed these because we wanted to explore the way in which new words enter the English language. What's interesting, though, let's go to the next slide, is that blending and compounding are the most utilized word formation processes. And you saw examples of those in many of the words we covered last week. A third popular word formation process is affixation, when you add a suffix or a prefix, such as the word selfie. This is actually another common way we get new words in the English language. So the top three are really blending, compounding, and affixation. Okay, I'm struggling to speak today, but we're going to get through this. One of the least common ways that we get new words is through lexical borrowing. Like I said, we briefly talked about this last week. You looked at emoji last week, which is a borrowed word from Japanese. And this type of borrowing is actually now becoming very rare. It's very rare to borrow a word from another language. Nowadays, we're not likely to borrow a word, but rather practice other word formation processes like blending, compounding, or affixation. But that's not always been the case. In fact, English is one of the most borrowed languages of all time. We've taken words from almost every language that exists throughout its history. When you look at the top 1,000 most common words in the English language, 80% of those words are actually native, meaning they're not borrowed from other languages. When we say they're native, we mean they come from German, and we will see in a later lecture that English is actually a Germanic language, closely related to German, right? So when we say native, we say it comes from our Germanic language family. So 80% of the top most commonly used 1,000 English words comes from our own Germanic language family. They're native words. However, when we talk about the top 10,000 words in the English language that we use every day, of those words, 60% are borrowed, meaning they do not have native origins. We have taken these words from other non-related languages. I like this quote. Over the centuries, English speakers have borrowed a cup of lexical sugar from nearly every global neighbor, and in some cases have carried away the barrel. It's a really cool quote. As we will see over the next few weeks, as we explore the history of the English language, we'll see that our language is heavily influenced by languages from all around the world, especially French. So as we enter this lecture, I want to introduce you to some linguistic terminology that will help you understand our lesson on the history of the English language. So to start with a loanword. A loanword is any time you have a word that is borrowed from a non-native language. We'll call this a donor language. So a non-native language is a donor language. And anytime this word is incorporated into a target language, the recipient language without translation. Okay, so a loanword is anytime you have a word from one language that's put into another language. The donor language is the language that is giving us the word, and the recipient language is the language that is taking the word and adopting it. For example, emoji is a loanword. Emoji is a loanword. Japanese is the donor language, and English is the recipient language. Sometimes we have types of borrowed words that are called a calque, and instead of taking the word or phrase as it is without translating, we translate the word into existing words that are part of our language, the recipient language. So an example of a borrowed word that is not translated is chocolate. We just took this word from Spanish, and we may pronounce it slightly different, but the word is essentially the same word in each language. This is a loanword. Alternatively, a calque. So we talked about what a loanword is. We just took the word from the language and we put it in our language. The word is essentially the same in both language. Alternatively, a calque is when the borrowed word or phrase is translated for the recipient language. So here we have an example of a French phrase. I don't know how to say this. I'm going to guess. Marapois. It's something like that. I YouTubed it before I made this video and I've already forgotten what it is. But here's here's the French term. And we borrowed this term from French and then we translated it into English, into our English sound system and our English terminology to mean flea market. That's what it means in French. And so we've translated it to English. And this is called a calque. So that's the difference between a loanword and a calque. One thing to know about borrowing is that it's a one-way street. So words are borrowed from high prestige languages into low prestige languages, and it doesn't work the other way around. So high prestige languages are not necessarily borrowing low prestige language words. So something we can deduce is that in the history of English, we have borrowed all of these words. Remember, 60% of the top 1,000 English words, as I just said a minute ago, are borrowed. So we can deduce that historically, English was a very low prestige language. But remember, at the beginning of this presentation, I said that nowadays it's not very common for us to borrow words. Now we rely more on compounding and blending. So this tells us that while historically English has been a low prestige language, that currently the prestige of English is very high because we're not currently needing to borrow words. So this tells us that something has changed in terms of the global perception of the English language. And we'll look further into that in future lectures. I'm sorry, guys. I don't know why I'm speaking so jumbled today. Maybe I'm hungry. I'm not sure what it is, but feel free to pause and repeat a slide if I've butchered it too much. All right, this has been a hard week to record, guys. My headphones just broke or my mic wasn't working. So I just recorded the next 20 minutes of our lecture and it didn't even work because it didn't capture my audio. So we're going to try again. If you haven't noticed, I've taken many attempts at this lecture already. So we're still talking about prestige, right? Language prestige. Generally, the reason that a language borrows a word from a donor language is that there's something attractive about that language. It seems prestigious, but it's not necessarily that the language that's doing the borrowing doesn't have its own words to express the same concept. So, for example, I'll give you the words email, hard drive, and computer. These are words that are associated with technology and it's associated with American culture. So you might have speakers of other languages in other countries discussing, let's say they're speakers in Arabic discussing something and they're speaking in their native Arabic language and they say yada 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 email, yada 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 hard drive, and they're sprinkling in these English terms in their conversation. And it's not because they don't have an equivalent meaning of those words in Arabic, it's just because it sounds prestigious to use those words. There's prestige in using words from other countries, right? Especially if we consider that a prestigious language. Okay, so moving on. Before we move on, there's a few more terms I want for you to know so you can keep up with the conversation. At this point, we covered loanword, calque, donor language, and recipient language. Go back to that slide if you don't remember what those are. But here's some additional terms I want you to know. We have monolingual. It's a person who only speaks one language. I'm monolingual. We have a bilingual person who can speak two languages, a multilingual person who can speak more than one language. Bilingualism, it's the process of a monolingual learning a second language, so the process of becoming bilingual. And then we have a polyglot, who is a person that is capable of speaking and writing in several languages with a high level of proficiency. So the reason these terms are important to know is that because many words that are borrowed from another language are a result of what we call language contact. That's when you've got two languages coming together or two languages being used in close physical proximity to each other. So what this creates is bilingual speakers who now have knowledge of two languages, and they are often the ones that are bringing loanwords into the other languages. When bilinguals fail to communicate, with their interlocutors. So when a bilingual person fails to communicate with another person they're speaking to, they can resort to one of several options to successfully communicate. And I want to cover those options real quick. So you have speaker A and speaker B, and they can't communicate. So their first option is that they decide to use a third language. They don't use the native language of either person, and they use a third language. For example, in my program, I have Shige from Japan and Mimi. So Shige speaks Japanese and Mimi speaks French. So they can't communicate in their native languages, but they also both speak English. So they use a third language to communicate. Speaker A and speaker B might decide to mix the two languages, or speaker B or these speakers can use different languages for different purposes. So from that, we get three different outcomes that I'm going to define further for you. So these are very simplified definitions of these three outcomes. We're going to go into each of them. So we have a lingua franca, Pidgin, also known as, can also be called creole, or can develop into creole, and code switching. We've talked about code switching a little bit, so that's not a new one, but let's look at a visual representation of what I just said. So again, we have speaker A speaks language X, speaker B speaks language Y. But the speakers decide to use language Z, a third language, to communicate, and this is what we call a lingua franca. If the speakers instead decide to mix together elements from language X and language Y, for example, maybe my friends decide, okay, let's use the sound system of French, but the syntax of Japanese, they create what we call a Pidgin language. So that's an example there. And we're going to define that one more because we're going to define that further in the lesson because I don't want you to confuse that with this next one, which is code switching, which is when you have language X and language Y, and you go back and forth and interchange between these two languages, and we call this code switching. This is not to be confused with Pidgin, and I'll explain in this lecture. So real quick, looking at lingua franca, you speak language X, I speak language Y, so we decide to use language Z to be able to communicate. It's using a language that is not the native language of either speaker, and currently English is used heavily as the lingua franca around the world. I think I keep saying lingua franca. I think it's lingua franca. So I don't know what's wrong with me today, guys. Let's keep going. It's week 11. That's the problem. Okay, so what's interesting is that we see a lingua franca being used around the world in specific disciplines. So for example, in air traffic controllers, there are air traffic controllers all around the world that do not speak English as a complete second language. They have they're technically monolingual speakers, right? They speak one language of whatever language of their country is, but they use English in their line of work for communication purposes only in their line of work, as an example with the air traffic controllers. So other languages have been used in this way as a lingua franca as well. But English is spoken by 2 billion people around the world, either as their first language, their second language, or as a lingua franca. This chart here, the inner circle represents those who speak it natively, so typically are monolingual speakers. The orange represents those that speak it as a second language, and the yellow circle, this represents those who use it as a lingua franca, as I said with those air traffic controllers. Well, let's look. So yellow and orange have outnumbered the red at this point, which is kind of cool. So there are more non-native speakers than there are native speakers of English in the world right now. And this is one of the reasons why we have so many varieties of English that exist. When we talk about this inner circle of English, this is where English is spoken, as I said, monolingually. And monolingual means what again? We covered it. Go back and look if you don't know. But monolingual means these speakers only speak one language. We have examples like British English, American English, Australian English. These are examples of the native English speaker groups of this inner circle. The outer circle, that next level out, is when you're learning English as a second language, which is very common, and in fact so common that speakers in the circle often develop or have their own patterns or rules in English. We have some examples here, like Indian English. In India, the speakers of the country have many different first native languages. There are many languages in India, but English is not necessarily their first language. They will have a native first language, but English is so common that all these people with a native first language will also learn English as a second language. But learning English there is so common that there's also what we have Indian English, which has a couple rules and patterns that are different than maybe the English we speak here in America. They do other things with transitive verbs, for example, that are very common in English there, in Indian English, not English here. And then we have the expanding circle, where English is being used as a lingua franca. English in this purpose has a foreign language status. And here are some places where English is commonly used this way. So again, we're talking about lingua franca, pidgin, and code switching. These are the three terms we're talking about. We just talked about lingua franca. Here we're going to talk about the second one, which is pidgin. This is where language X and language Y. Remember, you speak language X, I speak language Y, and we decide we want to mix them together so we can communicate. You've got two people whose first languages are different from each other. And instead of choosing a third language to communicate, or instead of going back and forth between the two native languages, we'll actually see what that is in code switching, right? These speakers decide to meld together. They make a pidgin language that has some features of one language, so has some features of language X and has some features of language Y. They may take some grammars from one language and some of the syntax features of the other language and take words from both language. And basically whatever language offers the most simplistic sounds comes together. They use those features and they bring them together to make a totally new hybrid language of the two languages. And this is Pidgin. So that's how Pidgin languages are created. These languages are usually very simple with very small vocabularies and have a very small range of sounds. They're usually just used for trade or for religion. It's not something that people are using in their everyday life. They are used for specific purposes to accomplish a task and be understood to each other. So here's a whole list of Pidgin languages around the world. Believe it or not, Hawaiian is actually a Pidgin language made from other languages. And there are many more listed here for you to see as well. A Creole language, because I don't know if you remember that first slide where we said Pidgin or Creole, is when you have a language, Creole language is when you have a Pidgin language that goes on to become more established. And at that point, we call it a Creole language. The third thing we've talked about, so lingua franca, Pidgin. The third thing we talked about is code switching. And this is when the speakers go back and forth between language X and language Y. It's not a hybrid mix of the language like Pidgin. It's not a new language thing. It's also not a totally separate language, like using a separate language like language Z, as in a lingua franca. We looked at code switching a little when we talked about dialects and switching back and forth between dialects. But the more typical definition of code switching has to do with switching between two different languages. Bilinguals do this a lot. And I see this on a daily basis with Spanish and English speakers who go back and forth between the two in one conversation. And there are different reasons that these speakers use code switching. One is that they can't recall a word in one language, so they switch over to the other language real quick to grab that word so they can continue speaking. Or sometimes it's difficult to explain a concept or express an idea in one language, so you may switch to the other to quickly communicate it. Sometimes people just code switch because both speakers are bilingual and it's a way of encoding identity. So I have a lot of friends here who are bilingual Spanish speakers and English speakers. I am monolingual, so when they're with me, they only speak English. But when I introduce them to another person that they don't know, but that person clearly speaks Spanish as well, they just jump right into it. the code switching between the English and Spanish, because there's something about communicating with that other individual. Hey, I'm like you. We have this in common. So there is a little bit of identity, as we discussed in our first weeks together, about blend in the language you use. So here's an example of code switching from Spanish to English, and this is an example of what we call lexical insertion. Sounds like a fancy term, but if you break it down, we know the meaning of lexical. Lexical means word, right? So we're talking about word insertion. So this is an example. I actually asked my friend Tatiana to record this sentence for you, so you can you actually hear her baby kind of crying in the background, but she's a native speaker of Spanish, and I thought she'd give a better representation of that. So here she is reading this sentence.
No entiendo por qué te has puesto tan picky. Ya sabes que no tenemos buns para las muchachas.
So picky and buns are not, these are the English words in that sentence, right? Picky, buns. They're not words that have been borrowed from English and into Spanish. So it's not like the speaker is just using borrowed words that have been borrowed from this language to Spanish. Rather, the speaker is performing code switching, because maybe, for example, they forgot what the Spanish word for buns was, so they just quickly grabbed the English word. That's different than what's going on in this sentence here. And I'm going to play for you real quick the audio recording of this sentence. Okay, so in this case, we're just talking about the word email and text, okay, not truck, email and text. In this case, these words are English words that have been borrowed into Spanish. So it's not necessarily the speaker code switching, right? These are words that the Spanish language has borrowed from the English language, and they were adopted into the Spanish language. So staying on topic, but changing note a little bit, here's a list of some words, examples of Spanish words that Spanish speakers will use when they are speaking English. So when a bilingual speaker of Spanish and English speaks English, these are common Spanish words that they tend to sprinkle throughout or code switch into their conversation. And yet, those of you that don't speak Spanish, these words might mean nothing to you. Maybe one or two of them on the list look familiar, but in general, these words mean nothing to you because they haven't been borrowed from Spanish into the English language. However, if you look at this list, like the last list, these are also lexical insertions that Spanish bilinguals commonly use or code switch with. But unlike the last list, these are terms that are becoming more commonly known by monolingual English speakers. They're becoming more adapted into the English language. These have been lexically inserted enough that monolinguals of English are beginning to kind of know these words. A great example of an earlier point that I made, that borrowing is often influenced by bilingual speakers, right? So here are words that bilingual speakers have used enough that aren't borrowed into English, but you can see how that progression is being made. So then you have this list here of words that have been inserted so often by Spanish English bilinguals that now pretty much everybody that speaks English knows these words and almost has no idea that these were originally Spanish words. We use these words all the time, and we don't think when we hear alligator or these words that we're using a Spanish origined word. The idea here is that many of the words we use every day originally belong to other languages. An example of how English and Spanish came into contact with each other. So we talked about that earlier, languages coming into contact. And when languages come into contact and they maybe share a geographical region, you get bilingual speakers that are able to switch back and forth between these two languages. And when they use certain words often in code switching, all of a sudden monolinguals are able to recognize these words, and these words start getting borrowed into the language and become a part of that language. By the way, this doesn't only exist between Spanish and English. Other languages have obviously made the same contact before. So to conclude, remember, lexical means word. right? We have a lexicon, we have a bank of words. Lexical means word. But more than just words can be borrowed in a language. We can have grammar and pronunciation borrowings as well. But for English, we've mostly relied on lexical borrowing for the English language. Another thing to remember when we talk about borrowed words is that sometimes they go through an assimilation process. So for example, in chocolate, I don't know if I'm saying it right, in Spanish, was borrowed into English. And we don't pronounce it the same way, but we borrowed that word into the English language, and we've assimilated it to sound like chocolate. We didn't take the phonology of the original word. We didn't take the Spanish sound. We made the word fit into our own language, into our own sound system. That's what we call this anglicizing, right? Anglicizing. But this is an example of word assimilation, right? We've assimilated the word so it fits in our sound system. We don't always assimilate words, as you guys saw in the bougie assignment exercise, and how some people pronounce it bougie. It's either bougie or bougie. If more people start pronouncing it as bougie and it becomes more popular, then we would say that we have assimilated that word. The last couple points, got 2 more slides. The types of words that get borrowed are often exotic, such as names of creatures or foods that are not familiar to a certain culture. Then we just borrow the word, and we saw this with words like sushi and burrito, right? Those food items weren't familiar necessarily to our culture. They're familiarized with other cultures, so we just borrowed the word verbatim into our language. Most borrowed words fit into one of these concepts, like arts or sciences. That's usually they fit into one of these concepts. So the last thing I want to talk about, the things that don't get borrowed from other languages are things like pronouns. It would be weird to borrow a pronoun like I or you, because words like this are function words that are typically connected to the grammars of a language. So there's no need to borrow this type of word from another language. Or words that represent universal concepts like mom and dad. Most languages have words for these. Whereas content words like nouns and verbs, we saw this with some adjectives too, are likely going to be borrowed words. Those are words that are more likely the types of words we would borrow. So that concludes this. All right. So hopefully this gives you some idea about the history of English and the way English is used and influenced. Over the next few weeks, we're going to try to learn more about when, where, and how we came into contact with different languages and what words we brought into the English language because of it. That concludes this lecture for week 11. Let me know if you guys have questions. Thank you.